Hi there. I'm Dr. Brenda Salter McNeil, and I am giving just a brief reflection on some of my thoughts around 2021 and how that's impacted my heart, my mind, my ministry as it relates to racial healing, racial reconciliation, my call for unity and reconciliation and solidarity in the church and in the world of those of us who are called people of faith.
Being an AAPI woman, it can be hard to know where I will be welcomed, where I can belong, and especially where my voice will be valued. Even though I am a ministry professional who focuses on justice, I haven't always been welcomed into conversations around racial equity, justice, and reconciliation, because people weren't sure if Asian people needed to be part of the conversation and why they would be.
I remember starting last year off with this curiosity around what would carry over into the new year. Would it be the new sense of awareness, the energy and movement toward real progress, the believability of BIPOC racialized trauma, the connectivity, the healing from deep, deep pain? Or would all those contents be put back into a jar, the lid that had been blown off be put back on top, sealed tightly, and that jar pushed back? And as a nation, we would yet again forget.
Well, hey, Undivided family, this is Tyler Burns with The Witness, and it is my honor to give a reflection on the year 2021, a year that many have infamously called 2020 Part 2. You know, it's easy for us to think that with the extension of a global pandemic, which has claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, with how the year started, an insurrection attempt by white supremacists at our Capitol building, many of whom donned Christian iconography as if they were following in the example of Jesus.
I remember lamenting and having this pit in my stomach and this frustration because that felt like a return to the ignoring, the forgetting as a nation.
It was, in my mind, horrific. And I'm not sure I'll ever forget it. It was horrible. It was unimaginable. It was unthinkable. And it was such a degrading way for people to conflate patriotism, nationalism, white supremacy, and then somehow wrap that up with Jesus Christ. And that makes the work I do super hard because I work with young people. And young people have seen this hypocrisy and this complicity with injustice, and they don't believe us anymore. They don't believe those of us like myself who claim faith in Jesus Christ, who say we believe that God is a God of righteousness and justice, and then somehow they watch other people who say they too represent Jesus Christ, and they are storming Capitol buildings, threatening people's lives, who say that the pandemic, the COVID pandemic is actually scientifically true, and that we would help each other if we would demonstrate solidarity by getting vaccinated, wearing masks.
Both seen and unseen was this unfolding horror as attacks against the AAPI community, especially our elders, absolutely skyrocketed. And since the pandemic began, more than 10,000 cases of harassment and attacks have been reported here in the US. And all of that by communities that have been socially and culturally conditioned to stay silent about our suffering. When 6 Asian women were murdered in Atlanta last year, a spotlight landed on my community and communities like mine. Many of us felt exposed. We felt vulnerable and afraid, even more than we had the year before. People were starting to see what many of us already knew, especially AAPI women. Our Asian bodies are disposable when seen through the lens of white supremacy. When our bodies and our efforts no longer provide comfort or profit, we can easily go from model minority to yellow peril, from crazy rich Asians to Kung Flu.
And then we moved to so much conversation around what is being taught in schools, actual history that has been taught for many years, and truth being renamed and repackaged as propaganda and harmful information.
We are living in very, very, very trying times. And one of the greatest casualties of war, in my opinion, is that we're losing a whole generation who don't believe in the church or the message of Christianity. Because in the words of James Baldwin, they can't believe what we say because they see what we do.
I know it's easy for us to think when we have disparate healthcare and economic outcomes when we see the continued flourishing of white supremacy, the continued flourishing of police brutality. It's easy for us to think of this year as an extension of the previous year's chaos and confusion.
Early in 2020, I had to stop going to stores because I was constantly harassed every time I went out. Even today, I struggle going places alone because I still don't feel safe. And I mean, those who are emboldened in their hate still exist and still persist today. But even though that reality exists, I feel a deeper truth emerging, and with it, a wonderful sense of hope. The wider BIPOC community absolutely wrapped its arms around the AAPI community through all of this. And the often fragmented AAPI community has started to come together. We began to learn our history and reckon with our identities, as well as with things like the anti-Blackness that permeates our communities. Conversations about race used to primarily live in a binary of black and white. They didn't exclude people like me, those who were in between. But things are changing as we start to share our stories with one another.
I think 2021 gave us a window of opportunity to think differently about these justice movements that many of us are a part of. If you think about the ways in which we're taught about justice movements in history, these great movements and great people, in my community, it'd be names like Ida B. Wells and Fannie Lou Hamer, Rosa Parks and Dr. King. We're taught to think about these people as reactionary. 2020 was a reactionary moment. It was a reactionary movement. It was a time when we saw something that shocked us, and we stood up against it. Many of us took to the streets, but many of us stopped there. We stopped at the reaction. And many of us think of these great men and women from our past and in our present, in our communities, as merely reactionary leaders. But that does them and us a disservice. You know, as I think about these great names, I no longer am that obsessed with how they reacted, but I'm actually much more concerned with what they created. They were not just reactors, they were builders. And what I think God is calling us to in this moment is to be people who build. Yes, it is important for us to resist injustice. Yes, it is important for us to denounce white supremacy, to denounce the forces and the people of hate. Yes, I think that is very important. But I think God is calling us beyond simply reacting to an uncommon creativity, to saying, what can we build? How can we cause our communities to flourish? How can we come together cross-culturally to create a better, flourishing, and a more just world? How can we use the latent resources that we have to put our hands to the plow?
I needed the hope. I needed to be refueled with the purpose that wasn't only steeped in pain. And so as I had the opportunity to experience different cohorts that were happening virtually across the country in the living and working undivided experiences, I had this renewed sense of hope and a refueling and a refilling. What I got to hear were stories from BIPOC individuals who talked about not having to show up in a space where much was required of them, but where there was something for them in a space of healing. And then I heard stories from white participants who talked about really reckoning with things that they hadn't thought about ever, and hearing stories and lived experiences of individuals that were different from them, and really understanding what their place was in this work, and that they too had to experience some healing in this space.
And so my belief is that the way forward for those of us who want to restore the credibility of the Christian message in this generation, we're going to have to live radically different and embody the message that we seek to share with others, because anything less than that just won't do it.
How can you create something in 2022? How can you be a part of something? How can you be a part of planting? God is calling us not just to fight, but also to farm. Not just to resist, but also to reimagine. And I think that's what this next justice movement, this next iteration of what continued, what started in 2012, what continues into 2020, 2021, and now 2022, I believe God is calling us to be builders, not just simply those who react, but those who create.
As we open ourselves up to including more communities, identities, and intersections, less people are left vulnerable on the margins. And that, I know, makes Jesus happy.
We need the builders.
Amen. God bless you.